Civilian targets in conflict zones have been the center of attention of international organizations, media platforms, and local authorities. Unfortunately, targeting of civilian populations has systemic dimensions that go beyond the violation of individual rights. Today, Tactics will be discussing the targeting of women, children, elderly, and the LGBTQI+ community as an element of total warfare in which societies seek a deeper level of validation, not just winning a battle. With us for this discussion is Ioanna Karamitrousi, a public relations expert and a graduate of conflict resolution and governance at the University of Amsterdam. Ioanna, kalimera, good morning.
Kalimera, and thank you very much for organizing this amazing event.
We also have Lyubka Trajanovska, an experienced activist with a demonstrated history of working in the civic and social organization industry.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Gloria Perinic is an educational rehabilitator and a positive discipline instructor. Hello, Gloria.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
And Israfil Ozgan, the Executive Director of Freedom Research Association based in Ankara, Turkey. Good morning, Israfil.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you all for taking the time to do this. Let's start, first of all, talking about civilians. They are those who are often caught in the crossfire, and states fail to protect them. Ioanna Karamitrousi, can you give us some examples of states that today continue to fail in protecting civilians?
Well, the United Nations Security Council will mark the 71st anniversary of the Geneva Convention this year by ending its catastrophic failure to protect millions of civilians around the world, whose lives and livelihoods are routinely ravaged by violations of the laws of war, according to Amnesty International. However, the picture is still incredibly grim. The reality on the ground is that civilians are targeted where they live, work, worship, or seek medical care. Parties to armed conflict unlawfully kill and forcibly displace millions of civilians, while world leaders shirk their responsibility and turn their backs on war crimes and immense suffering. Governments, in this respect, fail to protect those civilians from violence by states and armed conflict, according to Amnesty International. Unfortunately, the global response to widespread conflict from Nigeria to Syria is ineffective and shameful. A year of catastrophic violence had led to one of the worst refugee crises, as the number of displaced people worldwide topped more than 50 million for the first time since the end of the World War II. So most of them, almost 4 million refugees, have led a 4-year civil war in Syria, and about 95% are being hosted by Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, according to the data of the United Nations Refugee Agency. As people suffered an escalation in barbarous attacks and repression, the international community has been found wanting. So the international community was not there to deal with this issue and do something about it. To give you some examples, more recently, groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the so-called ISIS, have built their own grisly reputations for indiscriminately targeting civilians, conducting killings, engaging in medieval torture practices, and directing murderous terror campaigns. Somalia is another example where we can find the world's worst human rights and humanitarian crisis. All parties to the conflict, including the United States of America, have violated both the international human rights and the humanitarian law. Israel has repeatedly targeted civilians during military operations in Gaza since 2008, causing great destruction and loss of human life. Between March of 2018 and March of 2019, Israel used lethal force against Palestinian protesters, killing at least 195 people, including medics, journalists, and children. In South Sudan and elsewhere, conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence are occurring at shocking levels. Witnesses and victims of a brutal government-led offensive in April 2018 to July 2018 in the north of of the country described how civilians, including women, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities, were deliberately killed by gunfire, burned alive in their homes, hung from trees, and run over with vehicles. And I want to end by saying that 20 years after the United Nations Security Council pledged to do its utmost to protect civilians in armed conflict, and 70 years since the Geneva Convention, we have almost 70 million human beings displaced by wars and other violence, and this reflects the catastrophic failure of the world leaders to protect them and to do something more about it. So we need the international community to be here and to support those people effectively, and not just say words and do nothing about it. Thank you very much.
That's right. Thank you very much, Ioana. Amongst those civilians, of course, there is also the LGBT community, which is a vulnerable community at best. And at times of conflict, it becomes even more so. Israfil Özgan, when would you say that this vulnerability increases and why? Can you give us examples?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for this great organization, and I should thank you to you, Alina, and of course, the Angelos for inviting me. Let me start this way. LGBT people are already vulnerable group at the best of their times, because of their sexual orientation or sometimes their gender identities. During times of conflict, natural disaster, or sometimes widespread violence, this vulnerability increased, and often leaving LGBT people to experience a level of violence and exclusion beyond that borne by others. This heightened vulnerability arises for two reasons. First and the main one, in times of increased lawlessness and pressure on scarce resources, homophobia rises to surface and can be acted upon with impunity. Let's say pre-existing stigma becomes amplified. So, secondly, maybe less importantly, international humanitarian law pays little attention to vulnerabilities and needs of LGBT people. Both of these factors ultimately arises due to the past and present criminalization of homosexuality. Even where same-sex intimacy is no longer a crime, homophobia can persist and surface an extreme way in times of conflict or disaster. For an example of these violations against LGBT people in messy countries, Iraq and Syria. The rise of ISIS has brought an even more deadly dynamic into the Middle East, and especially in Iraq and Syria. The extremist groups follows a strict interpretation of Sharia law, and I believe sexuality is punishable by death. Homosexuality is punishable by death. Since ISIS has taken over swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, countless LGBT and suspected LGBT people have been slaughtered. According to the international human rights groups, most of them are shot, beheaded, stoned, and some of them thrown from the tops of buildings. Whereas vigilant groups are operating prior to ISIS taking control, could, in theory, face prosecution by the Iraqi or Syrian authorities for violence committed against LGBT people. However, ISIS now acts as a de facto state across the lands of Syria and Iraq. However, it's not only ISIS operatives and ideology that perpetrate violence against the LGBT community. As an example, that this kind of ideology is something general in these countries. In Iraq, in May 2014, a militia assembled by former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to fight ISIS, the name of the group, the League of the Righteous, published the signs around the Baghdad and the names and the neighborhoods of 23 people accused of the crime of homosexuality acts. The following month, the League of Righteous killed and beheaded 2 teenagers who were thought to be gay. Another 2 men were injured in the same attack. LGBT Iraqis and Syrians have been persecuted by intolerance, permitting all aspects of life. The biggest reason for this is the religious reason. Like Quran, like the Bible, disapprove of homosexuality. It was not only the state that abdicated their responsibility against the LGBT community. Especially, most families would rather harm their own children than see their so-called honor besmirched. Their vulnerability today is increased by the conflict, but exists on a continuum of long-term social exclusion, discrimination, and violence. As a result, the terror and the fear has kept the LGBT community who still have to live in those countries deeply underground. Thank you.
Thank you, Israfil. As violence is common against the LGBT community, it's also very common against women during conflict. So more specifically, during the Yugoslav wars, horrific crimes were committed against women. Yuka Trajanovska, as an expert in the field, what have been the consequences of these crimes?
Thank you once again, Eleni, for inviting me to this talk. So yeah, I will do a short gender analysis of the Yugoslav wars. I will start with a brief overview, first of all, of the Yugoslav wars, since in my analysis of these wars, in my point of view, these wars have lasted since 1991 until 2001. So why? Starting with the 10 days war for the independence of Slovenia, then followed by the Croatian War, 1991-1995, then the Bosnian War, 1992-1995, and then later on the war about Kosovo, 1998 and 1999, including the NATO's airstrike, which was lasting from March till June 1999, since this was a great part of the wars, and finishing with the armed conflict in North Macedonia, February and from February till August 2001. So some of us would argue, if even nowadays we live in peace times on these territories, unfortunately. Even though it is thought that the Yugoslav wars have ended with the Dayton peace agreement, the later wars over Kosovo and the leak of the conflict in North Macedonia are very closely related to the Yugoslav system, which led to the wars. But most importantly, the Yugoslav system led to a very similar way of battling these wars and influenced the choice of weapon. So one of the main weapons used in almost every war, except maybe the Slovenian and the one in North Macedonia, was rape. Mostly, majority of the people that were raped were women. According to UNHCR, 12,000 rapes were conducted on Bosnian and Albanian women, Muslim women, by the Serbian soldiers and paramilitaries. However, we can't overlook the fact that there were a lot of men raped as well in these conflicts, even though it's still unfortunately a taboo to talk about these topics in the Balkans. So systematic sexual assault or ethnic cleansing was the main weapon in the Yugoslav wars. However, this wasn't the only type of violence against women that was conducted during these wars. So as we know, women were already systematically ready to prepare to sacrifice their male relatives, such as the brothers, fathers, husbands, sons. In Yugoslavia, the army was obligatory only for the men. So these women were already prepared that whenever it comes to war, the man will be the one that will be sacrificed to the war. Nonetheless, before the start of most of the wars, Slovenian and Croatian women mostly organized protests. These protests were named Walls of Love, where they were demanding their sons to be discharged from the army by surrounding the army barracks. So even though there were limitation of freedom of speech and movement as another type of violence for the Yugoslav women in this period, some of these women have raised their voices. But the women who were speaking, especially against the rape during the war done to the women of the other side, of the other nationalities, they were the one proclaimed by their national governments as traitors. They were the ones seen as the enemies because they were defending the women from the other nationality. So by standing up for the other women, they were, in a way, in the point of view of the national governments, they were betraying their own people and their own nation. The other type of violence that was very common for the Yugoslav wars is displacement of women during and after the wars. This issue was caused mainly because of the ethnic cleansing of the territories, but as well because of the culture of mixed marriages in Yugoslavia. Women were once again judged, rejected, or expelled by their own parents or husband's family because they were of different ethnic backgrounds. So many of them had to not only leave their country, but leave the Balkans, leave the continent. Many of them have been displaced to other continents as well, just to save their marriages, mixed marriages with different nationalities. Killing of women and girls, especially the already impregnated ones, was also common in the wars. Trafficking in organs was very characteristic for the Kosovo War. There is even nowadays still a long list of disappeared people, among them many Serbian and Roma women and girls, which is believed that, still not proved, but believed that were killed and their organs were sold in Kosovo's Yellow House at that period. Worth mentioning as well, and very important, is the NATO bombarding of Yugoslavia. It was a major part, as I said already, of the Yugoslav wars, which affected largely civilians' lives. Why? So thousands of civilians were harmed or killed, their homes were destroyed, as well their working places, and displacements once again was a must. Another consequence of this bombing was the effect that depleted uranium had and still nowadays has on these territories. In the last 10 years, there is a huge increase of breast and ovary cancer among women, and it is believed, and in some places even proved, that it is closely related to the to the bombs with depleted uranium that were used on this territory, unfortunately. So every conflict has its pre and post conflict period. The violence against women is common for every phase of the conflict. A few examples of the post-conflict violence against women in the region are living in refugee camps, then rape in refugee camps, rape done by peacekeepers, which we cannot forget, and we have to speak about it because none has been yet, there is no tribunal for the peacekeepers to be judged about these crimes that they have conducted. Then increased sex trafficking, and there were many kids born with disabilities, as well as there is after the wars a lower right after the wars a lower participation of women in the parliament. So even bigger gender inequality. So there is a gendered continuum of violence which lasts even nowadays, 25 years after the wars. Even though in mainstream media and the Western communities, women of Yugoslavia are mainly presented as victims of these wars, we mustn't overlook the fact that these women had roles in the prevention process, and as well, maybe I would say they have the biggest role nowadays in the peace building and reconciliation process through the civil organizations. So we can conclude that the targeting of women in wars has a systematic background, and that the gender inequality, especially on decision-making positions, have led and are still nowadays leading to increased violence against women in war and in peace times as well.
Livka Trajanovska, thank you very much for that. Women, of course, are not the only victims of conflict. Violence against children during conflict is also severely underreported. Gloria Perinic, can you tell us how children suffer in times of conflict and what the effects of this is on society as a whole?
Hello, everyone. Actually, every 5 minutes, one child dies as a result of abuse. And every year, at least 1 billion children suffer some form of abuse. When we talk about children in modern warfare, numbers testify the rise of victims, despite all the international laws and humanitarian organizations. In 2017, for example, there was 420 million children living in conflict-affected areas, which was up 30 million from 2016. More children are living in areas affected by armed conflict and war now than any time in more than 20 years, actually 1 in 4. Nowadays, conflicts are fought among civilian populations, so wars are being fought not between countries, but within them. And 90% of victims of conflicts are civilians. Half of them are children. Various government organizations and NGOs like UNICEF, Save the Children, etc., say that children younger than 6 should not be exposed to television coverage of the attacks, while children in war and conflict areas are facing it daily. And not just seeing it, but a great number of them are included as cooks, messengers, spies subjected to sexual exploitation or recruited as combatants. For example, 2019, there were more than 7,000 children drawn into the front lines of battle. Some of them are taken by force, while others join due to economic or social pressure. There is also an increase in the number of documented violations against children, especially 2017 saw the large increase. There are also some gender differences. For example, boys are more often killed or maimed, while girls are more victims of sexual violence. When we talk about sexual violence, there is also, it still stays unreported due to lack of access, stigma, and fear. But for example, between 2005 and 2018, there were almost 20,000 verified cases of sexual violation against children. Traumatic events create impact on emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and psychological functioning of every child. And there are children who have suffered traumatic loss of their parents, siblings, peers, and it was documented in developed greater incidence of post-traumatic stress disorders. Also, many children lost one or both of their parents, and it leaves them in even more need of care and even more vulnerable. So there is also peer-to-peer aggression in rise in these areas. In all these situations, education is particularly crucial for both protection and the development of children affected by conflict. Apart from contributing to their development, educational activities provide them with psychosocial support and help create at least some sense of normality. Unfortunately, the reality is, despite this need, humanitarian assistance for education is severely underfunded, since the more immediate life-saving provisions of food, shelter, and medicine usually take priority, of course, in emergencies and crises. For example, of the approximately 75 million children who are out of school, half live in conflict areas. And it is important also to mention that refugee children are 4 times more likely to be out of school than other children. All this mentioned has a great number of lifelong negative impacts. Children born of war are commonly faced with discrimination and stigma, and it makes them even more vulnerable again to trafficking and ending up on the street. The worst affected war zones is in Africa, with 170 million living in war zones. In the Middle East, for example, nearly 1 in 3 children was surrounded by conflict. And in Afghanistan, for 18 years of conflict, there was no child born into peace. To better monitor, prevent, and end attacks on children, the United Nations Security Council has identified 6 grave violations against children in times of war. There are killing and maiming of children, recruitment and use of children by armed forces, attacks on schools or hospitals, rape or some other sexual violence, abduction, and denial of humanitarian access to children. To conclude, much more needs to be done to prevent war and to end the many disasters and conflicts devastating children's lives.
Gloria, thank you very much. Emily, thank you very much for your time. This was a very informative session. Thank you for today.
Thank you too.